Welcome, this is Najma Minhas with Mueet Bizada on GBS Dialogue. We're looking at the continuingly evolving situation in Russia and Ukraine. With its day 18 of this crisis now, and Russia is no longer seems any closer to capturing Kiev. In fact, it's looking bogged down. Do you think Putin was trapped?
I think it's a fair question to raise on day 18th of the war, that if Putin and his Russian military machine had been trapped into a very difficult situation within Ukraine that was very well prepared by the Americans, by the NATO for this coming conflict. And throughout this tension phase, which started actively, which was actually going on for the past several years, but from June 2021, when it became obvious and Putin started giving orders for exercises and mobilization and all that. At no point had the US administration, which is actually the NATO, and despite European reservations, we've seen how the German chancellor and the French president actually went to Russia to resolve this, but they didn't have the command on the situation. So the Americans...
No, what do you mean they didn't have command of the situation? The Americans were warning us that this is about to happen for months in advance, almost since December.
True, 100% true. No. In fact, we woke up to the reality around February or January, and Americans were warning from December. But now, as we have gone back and checked all the publications, it is obvious that from June, from a Putin speech somewhere in the June, it was obvious that this war is coming.
Right.
What I'm saying is that whereas the Europeans wanted to stop the war because of implication for the Europeans, in 3 European countries, the Germans, the French, and the Italians were very worried for the implication and the effect of this war. The American leadership, the Biden administration, actually took no serious step to engage Russia on the issue, and they allowed the situation to slide. And now, in hindsight, this is now a debate inside Russia as well, because this war is being watched very carefully by the militaries of all the region and everyone. So Chinese are looking very carefully. Indian military is looking very carefully. Pakistani military is looking very carefully.
Okay, so but what are the...
And they are raising this question. Among their own debate, the question is being raised, is this a war of choice? The way the CNN, the BBC and the West portrays it, that Putin had the option of not doing the war, or was this a war of compulsion in which they pushed things in a way that Putin and his military had no real option. So they, in the end, in desperation, they said, this is a war coming, we have to take it in 2022, or else we'll have to fight in 2023.
So basically, do you think at this point Putin's now become bogged down in this war because he's not any closer to taking Kiev? And I don't know, he has control on certain parts of the south of Ukraine, but to what extent does he have the ability to actually take control of Ukraine itself?
There are 2 parts to your question. The part 1 is Putin bogged down. Now, we can discuss the circumstantial evidence in front of us. We can't get into the mind of Putin. Putin is believed to be a very intelligent person. We have been told again and again that the 2 most intelligent...
He's very calculating.
He's very calculating.
Right.
So, whereas now with a little bit of research, what we're doing for the past 18 or 20 days, we have learned so many facts, right? That this was happening. Americans were preparing, special services groups were preparing the Ukrainians in the form of a resistance for a long insurgency, $3 billion of small weapons. Because when you look at $3 billion figure, if you have to purchase Rafale or F-16 or expensive attack helicopters, then $3 billion might not be a huge sum. But if $3 billion is in small weapons like Stinger missiles or, or the Javelin anti-tank and other thing, or IT equipment, then $3 billion is a huge amount for training and purposes, right? So if we have known all these facts now, Putin and his close people must have been knowing all this. So to argue this thing that Putin has walked into a trap without realizing the implications or the kind of response that will be generated is a little difficult supposition in terms of analysis. But from the circumstantial, what we are looking at it, and once again, when we look at the circumstantial evidence and all that is being published or being talked on television, we have to understand this, that all the information field in the world is being controlled by United States.
Right.
It's Western
allies. So Western sources is where
we're
getting our information.
From the Western sources, the impression, what we pick up is that Putin and his military thought that they will have a very easy cake walk, just like they had in 2014, February or March into Crimea.
So you're suggesting that Putin didn't necessarily think he was going to be walking into Ukraine or walking into Kiev rather?
I think it's difficult to believe from Putin's mind, from a Putin's perspective, if Putin knew the kind of preparation Ukraine has done. Of course, Putin has the best possible intelligence on it. So he must have known that this is not Crimea of 2014, right? And he must have understood this thing, that advancing towards Kyiv or Kharkiv in the north and the west and the northwest would be difficult. And probably, because we also see this, that the Russians have been able to make much more better advance, and they have consolidated their position in the south of Ukraine, where the sea is, and 60% of the import-exports of Ukraine are taking place from the south. You know, one major key port city is the city of Odessa. Once Odessa falls, because what Russian strategy at the moment is, because Russians have several limitations. One major limitation of the Russians is because they don't have any control on the information. They don't have any control on shaping the narrative. They've lost whatever limited ability they had in the form of Sputnik and RT has been lost, and they have been blocked out of the internet service providers, and whatever counter opinion existed in the West, like Professor John Mershamer.
I mean, I'd like to get to the narrative part later, but I mean, if you talk about a little bit more about strategy, I mean, you're saying that Putin must have calculated this into his strategy, and he's not going slow probably by his standards. That's what I think you're trying to tell me.
Yes, I'm trying to explain this thing, that one particular reason for his for slow march of the Russians is the Russians know this thing, that they are the demons and the bad guys in this war. The way the world sees it, the way Ukrainians see it, the way Russian public sees it. They're even unable to give their own perspective to the Russian public, right? Because they have no real ability to reach out in the form of the platforms. And from an information point of view, they have lost this war in a very bad way. They're still calling it special operations in Ukraine. They're not calling it a war. And when they use the term special operation, they impose certain kind of limitations upon themselves to basically give information to their own public and to the world media. So if you look at the stories on the RT, they're very Russian TV, which are still available in Pakistan, the website. These stories are very different and limited in character as compared to the kind of the stories that are appearing in New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, BBC, Deutsche Welle, Al Jazeera. The Western media paints about people fleeing from the war, children being killed, hospitals being attacked, cancer hospitals being attacked. Russians are giving a much more different kind of information and admitting as well that there's collateral damage as well. So when we move to large population centers, the strategy which they have adopted is the strategy of siege. It's more like a 19th century and 20th century, not even 20th century. This is purely a sort of an older strategy that they want to encircle the cities. So they have almost completely encircled Kharkiv, which is the second largest city, and they've almost completely encircled Kyiv, which is the largest city. But Kyiv had a population of slightly less than 4 million, between 3 to 4 million. And 3 or 4 days ago, the mayor of Kyiv had admitted to Western media, there was a story in New York Times, that almost 2 million population of Kyiv has fled the city. So the city now has probably 1 million plus people. Russians are continuously providing safe corridors for the population to leave, creating the argument.
No, but if they want to occupy Ukraine, why are they wasting time doing a 19th century tactic of siege? I mean, which I'm assuming applies that Russian soldiers slowly are taking hold of the ground territory. Why not come in with the Air Force and do carpet bombings? I mean, that's what how Americans were successful in Iraq, for example.
This is where the Russian strategy is very different from the American strategy. 2 wars come to mind. The 2003 invasion of Iraq and the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan. The American strategy was never to put the ground soldiers or the feet on the ground, in the sense that in Iraq, the forces were there, about 150,000 allied forces, but they would first do heavy bombardment, which is called in military terms as softening. And then when the enemy had been destroyed and they had no structure to defend themselves, they moved through their columns, and at that time there was very little capability of resistance. They had done such huge bombardment. And they did the same thing with the help of daisy cutters when the advancing columns in Afghanistan in 2001, October, November, were basically of the Northern Alliance. There were no US presence except from some very patchy special groups presence. So they never actually faced the enemy firepower. Russians do not have that luxury because Russians do not have the narrative shaping machine on this side. So Russians...
But they do have something called the Global Hawk planes or something.
No,
right?
the Americans have the Global Hawk planes.
Okay,
this is
sorry.
RQ-4. And these are very heavy special drone planes that Americans fly 4 times every day. And the Western media doesn't even mention that. So the whole intelligence operation of the war, where the Russian columns are, the tanks are, the military is moving, the Americans have that information and Americans share. So basically, it would be fair to say that this is not Russia fighting underdeveloped Ukraine. It's Russia fighting United States with all the logistic structure, intelligence capability of NATO, right? So since Russians do not have an ability to shape the information on the war, they cannot shape a narrative on this war. They do not have you see, when Americans are doing heavy bombing in Iraq or Afghanistan, they were painting their victims not as victims, but as the villains, right? So Americans were the good guys. They were the liberators. They were fighting for democracy, for the world, and against the dictatorship in case of Iraq and against the demons and the terrorists in case of Afghanistan. Russians do not have the luxury. You see, Russians are fighting according to the international narrative. So Russians are not able to tell the world or to the people anywhere that they are fighting a war of compulsion in which they have been persuaded to fight a situation in which they have been trapped, right? And it is part of their national security, the way Russia was trapped and and they were looking towards a war that was coming towards them, and they're trying to do a preventive war at this time, not to fight a war in which they would be even more in a more difficult situation, say 2 years down the line. But this narrative, Russians are unable to bring forward. If you are a strategist like John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, then you can understand, or if you're a Henry Kissinger, you will understand what is really happening to Putin and to Russians at the moment. But so Russians are the bad guys that are attacking the innocent Ukrainians, right? So Russians have to be very careful on the cost of the civilian casualties. So that is why they're providing safe corridors again and again. And when 3 or 4 days ago, United Nations figures were that there were less than 500 civilian fatalities or deaths in Ukraine. On the day 14th or 15th. Maybe they are 1,000 by now. But Russians have also lost almost 1,000 or more than 1,000 soldiers because they admitted losing almost 500 soldiers several days ago. So Russians are fighting by inch, soldier by soldier, facing the fire from the other side. They do not have the luxury of using the Air Force the way Americans had the luxury of using the Air Force. So we see the Air Force operations are very specific, very targeted, on airfields, aerodrome, intelligence centers, signal intelligence, drone centers where you're flying the drones and so on. So it's a very difficult, and that is why the militaries of India, Pakistan, China for obvious reasons, I mean, it's a message to them if they actually move towards Taiwan. How can Americans actually cripple them diplomatically, international business point of view, sanctions, reaction towards them?
So I'd like to bring to you the fact that a lot of Western companies have taken action in China. They've backed out of, Russia. They've backed out of Russia, whether it's Facebook, all of social media sites, they've closed them down. Instagram has been closed down and has moved out as well. WhatsApp is still working. I'm surprised, but it is still working. One interesting thing is that internet service providers are actually coming out of Russia as well. Namecheap is one of the largest ones in the world. I mean, what impact is that going to have on Russia? So
there are 2 interesting dimensions to it. When we see the news, every company that comes forward and says it is getting out of Russia, especially these internet companies and these other social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, and whatever, the argument is this, that this is the international or global civic society that is reacting against the Russian brutality or the fact that Russia has done an unthinkable thing. But there is a strategic and military dimension, which I found from sources, that these steps which these companies have been forced to take, not necessarily voluntarily, but they have been advised to take these steps, because these steps have helped in the strategic isolation of Russians. For instance, when because Russians had developed an awesome capability of denial of service attacks on Western institutions.
Cyber attacks and so on.
Cyber warfare, right? By denying them, now when you have literally cut off Russia from the worldwide internet, Russians have lost the ability to fight those kind of attacks. They are, and every platform that existed or operated inside Russia was in fact a way for the Russian people, the Russian media, the Russian public opinion on the war to come out, right? Now, what the Russian people are thinking or might be thinking is also told to the world through the American controlled media. So the American controlled media tells that there are hundreds and thousands of demonstrators on the Russian streets, and there are thousands of people that have been arrested, and the Russian public is very upset by a war. And the narrative they want to shape is this, that this war can actually bring down Putin's government and regime.
Right. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about the biological labs that we're hearing a lot about. We heard initially a couple of days ago the fact that these existed, and the Russians had found almost 26 of them. And we've also heard the same thing from Chinese sources. But today, the WHO, in fact, made a statement and asked Ukraine to make sure that it curtails and ensures the destruction of these pathogens. But US generally has been saying these are laughable claims, this is fake news. What do you think is the reality behind this?
No, this is... You see, the reality is this, that there is a very interesting piece written by Scott Ritter, I think his name is Scott Ritter, that once used to work for the US Marine Intelligence and then joined United Nations as a biological or weapons inspector on case of Iraq. And then I think he turned anti-US establishment, and written some books as well. He had written an opinion piece and an analysis that was published by the Russian site RT. And he points out that both Ukraine and United States have to come up with some very good answers on the issue of these biolabs, which have been biological weapon facilities present inside Ukraine. Now, he says that as soon as the attack started to take shape on 24th, within February, the US Embassy issued a press release or an explanation that we are maintaining what is called as the biological threat reduction programs within Ukraine with the help of the Ukrainian government, and we are helping them. And these are essentially research facilities. So these can help in identification of these dangerous pathogens in case of a strike or in case of in case of an epidemic and so on, right?
If that's the case, then why did Victoria Nuland, who's the Undersecretary on Political Affairs, US Undersecretary on Political Affairs, go to a Senate Foreign Relations Committee and say that we're really worried that the Russians may actually use these laboratories and may spread out some of this biological warfare?
Yes, I mean, Scott Ritter, in his piece, which is, the piece title is "Do Ukrainian Biolabs Violate Ban on Biological Weapon Program?" Right? He mentions Victoria Nuland's strategy, and he dissects that. And he says Victoria Nuland's question and the dialogue that took place between him and the Marco Rubio, the Republican senator from Florida, that was actually a scripted thing. So they both, he raises the question, Rubio raises the question, do Ukrainians have the biological and chemical warfare capabilities? And in response to this, Victoria Nuland admits, though that was not part of her initial speech, she says yes. She says by saying that we have been maintaining certain research facilities to help the Ukrainians with this.
Then why are they worried then if it's research only?
And we are very worried now that, these pathogens can get into the hands of the Russians and they can misuse that. So the Americans were ready that in case these are caught out, we can turn this into propaganda. And Russians are now worried that, because Russians are very worried. I mean, this is another thing which I found out, that Ukraine has on the West about 3 to 4 NATO member states, like Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, right? And they're very worried that an accident can be created, a false accident can be created within Ukraine that can justify for NATO, because you see there are a lot of demands within United States and Europe and Ukraine. The NATO should come up and give us the flight cover, no-fly zone and all that. So they don't want any accident to take place within Ukraine that allows NATO to create a pretext for widening this conflict, right? And so
very interesting, actually.
That is why they have requested. They have already requested the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, to basically call an emergency session. I think it happened 24 hours ago, that they've requested United Nations Security Council to come up to basically discuss this issue. They want an explanation from the Americans.
Okay.
So whatever limited ability they have in terms of coming up with a counter narrative, they want United States to be pinned down so that United States cannot do anything. They're saying we destroyed our biological and chemical weapon facilities in 2017,
right.
but United States still maintains that. One more important point, right? I don't believe this, the Russians might have totally destroyed their capabilities. There's a lot of gray area in this. We are just still witnessing that continuing epidemic that started from China in the city of Wuhan, apparently from Marketplace in 2019. Whereas no one officially says or admits, but the conspiracy theorists have this intelligent, they keep on theorizing this thing. They note the thing that American establishment, the military sources and the research facilities are shouting continuously for the past 3 years. They look because Trump used to say that this was perhaps a leak from the labs and whatever.
Right.
These are not lab-made viruses. We have analyzed that it came from an animal source, right? The conspiracy theorists argue that it is quite possible that someone released a biological weapon in Wuhan with the idea to slow down and totally destroy the rise of the Chinese economy.
Okay.
But it backfired because Chinese, being dictatorial and scientifically dictatorial, were able to control the spread of the pathogen. And then someone goes ahead and releases a pathogen that was far more tailored for the Western people.
Okay.
Because when you look at the world, the loss of life and damage in the Western societies was far more. The pathogen had the capabilities of attacking the Western genotype, right? So, of course, it's hush-hush and no one wants to talk about it.
Okay.
Now, the discovery of these labs, which Russians say is on the border of Ukraine and Russia, brings a new twist to what was being done over there.
Okay, so that's obviously a continuing story, an ongoing story. What I'd like to ask you is there's been 3 rounds of negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And in fact, I think it was a day or two ago when the foreign ministers from both countries, Russia and Ukraine, met in Turkey as well. And none of these talks have been successful so far. So who's holding out here? Why has there been no progress at all?
I think the first 2 rounds took place in Belarus, right? The way it happened is that immediately after 24th February, the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian president asked for these talks, right? Then he wasted 24 to 36 or 48 hours. Well, Russians stopped their war. They said, we have suspended the military operations because they thought that the Ukrainians really want to come up with meaningful talks with them. And then the Ukrainians disappeared. And the Russians, meanwhile, had suspended the military operations. Then when the talks took place, Ukrainians expected Russians to stop the military operations, but Russians basically thought that what Ukrainians are probably wasting time and they're not coming up with meaningful concessions to what the Russians want. So Russians had at least 3 meaningful concessions they want. They want Ukraine to guarantee that Ukraine will never ever join a NATO military alliance, one. The second want the thing which is even more difficult for Ukraine. They want Ukraine to accept the legitimacy of the autonomy or the freedom or independence of the Donbass region of Lugansk and Donetsk, right? And I think they also want legitimacy for the Crimea. So unless the Ukrainians can come up with admission on these things, they said the talks are not really making any meaning. Ukrainians, on the other hand, say that you should immediately seize the military operation and Russian forces should get out. So the talks do not achieve anything. What talks have achieved in case of the Ankara talks in Turkey is that they have went on to provide safe corridors for the citizens to leave, which has worked. And
I mean, do you think Russia is taking a maximalist position, especially by going into Kiev? Because obviously it knows it can't control Kiev, right? So is that maybe why it's pushing towards Kiev? Because it feels it has to, if it has to give away, it'll say, okay, we're going to leave X, Y, and Z cities, but you need to do this, which is give the independence and you declare yourself a neutral country and not a NATO.
I think initial maximalist position of Putin was that Putin wants the regime change. That he wants to change the regime with the President Zelensky, right? So the maximalist position has more or less disappeared. Now Russians need to control Kyiv. It's very important for Kyiv to fall and surrender to the Russians, which probably will still happen within the next several days. It should have happened within the first week or 10 days, but now on the day 18th, it hasn't happened. So, but it's quite possible that within the next, say, week, Kharkiv and Kyiv surrender. And what the Russian strategy is to totally surround these cities so their population leaves. And once the civilian population leaves, Russians will be at more freedom to attack these cities in more ruthless fashion, which they're unable to do because of the fear of the loss of the civilian life. The fall of the key will give Russians something serious and meaningful for negotiation with the Americans. We must keep in mind this is Russia and United States fighting each other. The rest of all are secondary players.
So I'd like to ask you a little bit, you refer to it several times, this whole war on narrative, the strategic element of narrative here. And of course, Putin's done a disastrous job in terms of being able to portray any side that he could justify why he did what he did. But do you think domestically he was able to do any better?
We don't really have any access to Russian domestic opinion because, of course, we can't really trust what is being published in RT or in Sputnik. But even from
RT and Sputnik are providing for the domestic audience as well, no?
No, they're actually international platforms, right? So Russian domestic media is almost all in Russian, right? They're not necessarily in English. So we don't really have any access. But whatever, because on Twitter you can translate the tweets, right? But now you don't know where the tweets are coming from. The tweets are coming from dissidents, anti-Putin sections.
I mean, Twitter has been cancelled in Russia.
Yeah, Twitter has been cancelled in Russia. And the tweets are also coming in Russian from the Russian language Ukrainians, right? And they may be US sources. But it looks like that this war is not popular in Russia, what information we have, for various reasons. Well, there is a resistance against Putin. Of course, there is an opposition to Putin, which Putin suppresses. I mean, he has got the legal provisions to continue as president till 2136, right? I mean, 2036. And so, but also there is a factor that the Kiev Rus culture is very integral to the Slavic culture, to the Russian culture. And the idea of fighting on this turf is not a very popular idea. So this is definitely an unpopular war. So Putin has a lot of problems. You know, he has to quickly come to a conclusion within the next, say, 10 days or 15 days. And he has to get something to claim victory that can help him to negotiate with the Americans, with the help of the Europeans, to get rid of the kind of sanctions. You know, the sanctions which a banker was telling me, a Pakistani banker was telling me that as the Americans started to come with the sanctions, he was amazed at the range of sanctions that can be applied to a country.
Or in the latest, they just removed Russia from the free trade agreement. So huge numbers. Now, what do you think is the lesson that other countries, maybe India or China, are taking from this? I mean, especially China. What do you think they're learning from what's happening to Russia?
I think you should divide this question into several subset questions, but let me explain the first part. Many in Pakistan and many other countries, in China, for instance, have always complained that we do not have, their narrative is not coming up in the global narrative or in the Western narrative, right? Pakistan has always complained, and Chinese also have that limitation. They also feel the same way. And Russians had developed some sort of ability through RT and Sputnik to come and give their point of view. So they hired American boys and girls to run RT operations in the United States. They had some presence. Also, Russians are part of the European culture in West for the past several hundred years now, right? So Russians had a perspective. How quickly the Americans have been able to disconnect Russians from the international narrative platforms. So Russian narrative is nowhere. Now, this is in fact quite a moment for Chinese and Pakistanis and Central Asians and Russians and everybody else, after all these 35 nation states which have abstained in the United Nations General Assembly, that what is the alternative, right? If all the narrative is ultimately controlled by United States, and the only way your voice can be heard is if you mix your voice with the Western narrative. And most of the time, the Pakistanis and Chinese and the other countries which are not on the right side of the American power at the moment do not fully understand. Indians understand that. So when Indians speak on an issue, they mix their narrative with the predominant Western narrative because this is how they have aligned themselves. Pakistanis are on the wrong side of the Western narrative and Chinese are on the wrong side of the Western narrative. So their voice is never heard. Whatever. But now they have seen that if someone's voice could be heard, Russians had the ability to bring out their narrative in English, but they were disconnected from the platforms. Their narrative cannot
come. Removed.
I think one important thing that will come out, or initiative that will come out, I think the Chinese and Russians and even the Turks will think of creating their own platforms.
Right. Which China already has.
China already has.
And even Russia has been working on an internet system. I mean, most likely it will develop that further. And that's one of the thoughts that actually came to me, that even the fact that the way the economic sanctions have been applied on Russia, the way Russian exports have been banned, other sanctions have been applied. Western companies have left Russia. In fact, it's left behind a vacuum which other companies will come in and fill. So the question that comes to me is, in a way, in the long run, will this not actually threaten Western global domination and the whole concept of globalization as well?
And this is precisely the fear on which Professor John Mersheimer of the Chicago University, Henry Kissinger, and many others, which you call as the realist school, which is now under pressure within, I mean, if you see, there are people within the United States and Europe actually blaming them, for giving wrong ideas. But these people, these scholars and these, which are actually the best part of the Western scholarship and academia, have been arguing from 2014 onwards that Russia is not the real enemy. Russia has serious limitation in terms of its economy, in terms of its technology.
It's a middling power.
It's a middle power. It's a declining power and for various reasons. And China is the real power and China is the real threat. So we should not push Russia into Chinese arms, right? Because when you look at the geographical positioning of Russia and China, China is at one end of the Eurasian landmass and Russia is at the other end of the Eurasian landmass, right? So don't push them together. And this is what John Mersheimer had argued in his lectures in University of Chicago and other places and his writings, right? And now he's being blasted for basically saying this. And this is precisely what is happening at the moment, that if anyone can bail out Russia, that is the China. And China has already taken steps in terms of purchase of oil and gas and other commodities, though there are limitations. And the analysts also are watching to what extent the Chinese are going to help Russia emerge from this crisis.
Right. But there's two elements, right? One element is, how does China work with Russia, given this scenario? And second element is, how does this reflect on China when it looks at its own foreign policy or its policy vis-a-vis Taiwan, for example?
It's a huge question for China. And Chinese are watching and Chinese are raising voices. Chinese usually remain silent on most conflicts. But in this particular conflict for the past 18 days, Chinese foreign ministry and their spokespersons are very active. Right? The media is very active and it's pretty obvious that where they stand on this conflict.
Right.
Now, the American media or the policymakers are trying to tell Chinese that, look, your behavior depends upon, you have to behave as good guys and, you shouldn't really put your weight into the Russian side. And there can be consequences for this. And there are stories appearing in Western media that how Chinese are thinking hard on Putin's failure and the fact that Putin is actually stuck in Ukraine. But
I even read a story in CGTN that Chinese are starting to send humanitarian aid to Ukraine.
Yes, that's true.
What does that mean?
They're sending blankets, medicines, and, night searchlights and things like this. I think, of course, the China, being a major power, has to keep the sympathies of everybody, including Ukraine. And ultimately, Ukraine is not going to disappear from the surface of the earth, even if it's being politically controlled by the Russia. But to assume this thing, the Chinese will somehow or the other be so frightened by Russia's plight and crisis in Ukraine that they will switch their loyalties away from Russia to the West is unthinkable. This kind of thought takes place in Pakistani politics, because Pakistani politics is very underdeveloped, Pakistani thinking is very confused and muddled. So people keep on saying we need to jump from China back to US. We need to jump from US to China. We need to do this. We need to do this, because they do not have a fuller understanding.
Right.
Chinese do not have the option and luxury of leaving the Russians like this.
Okay.
Because if today it is Russia, then tomorrow it's China. Right. So Russia has to be bailed out. Chinese have to ensure this thing in their own way that Russia doesn't collapse.
Right.
I mean, if as a result of this conflict, the Putin government or regime collapses in Russia, then China will be actually, if an anti-Putin regime takes place in Russia, for instance, theoretically, where the China stands on the global stage, that means China will be next. That means China's ability to maneuver on the international stage would be curtailed, would be very restricted. So Chinese have to stand by them, and same now is the question for India. Like, whereas India has 60 plus agreements with US, and India has aligned.
It's a strategic partnership with the US.
It's a strategic partner with the US, but India also has to watch very carefully. Its military dependence was with Russia. India would not.
Almost 60% of its arms come from Russia.
Yes, 60%. I mean,
And
I've been 60%.
It's Russia's largest, in terms of looking at it from Russian perspective. India buys almost $6 billion worth of things from arms from Russia. It's Russia's largest arms importer.
Agreed, 100%. And so the Indian strategic community is watching this conflict very carefully. So Putin has to deliver for everyone. So Putin's machine, I mean, Putin being disconnected from the world, his reliance is on his military, which had the reputation of being a strong military, which appears stuck from the Western lens at the moment. It has to deliver for Putin and for Russia. It has to deliver for China-Russia alliance. It also has to deliver for India and rest of the world. If you look at the United Nations General Assembly vote, these are only 35 countries. But these 35 countries, which are on the other side of the US or the Western divide, include China, 1.4 billion, includes India, 1.4 billion. It includes Russia, of course, with 300 million.
Bangladesh, Sri
Lanka, it has Pakistan,
Algeria,
220 million.
Large number of countries
almost
in Africa.
200 million Bangladeshis. It has Sri Lanka. It has Vietnam. It has Africa. It has whole of Central Asia. So more than half the population, well above half the population
of the world,
of the 7-8 billion population in the world, is actually on the other side of this conflict.
They abstained on a vote with Russia. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about that. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things that comes to my mind is the West is starting to ask this question. Do you think they're doing enough soul searching? That why did, let's say, 3.5-4 billion people of the population of the world vote or abstain on this thing?
Apparently,
what kind of soul searching is happening in the West to reflect on this?
The way the climate is at the moment, there are no visible signs of any soul searching. Right now, Putin is the evil. He has done the unthinkable. He's a madman. He's a megalomaniac. And anyone who has sided with Putin or has abstained from the debate or is not openly condemning Putin, like Pakistan or the Pakistani Prime Minister or the Indians or the Chinese, are actually doing a very bad thing. They're part of the evil. They're not responsible.
So it's almost like 2001 when we hear about this call that calls
with us or against us.
Colin Powell, you're with us or against us. Exactly. So they're seeing it in a binary form.
I think whatever...
So no reflection is being done on why the rest of the global South may have not voted with them.
Whatever factions like Professor John Mearsheimer and Henry Kissinger and the other realists that exist within the United States and UK are not either keeping silent and numb or they're not finding any space. I mean, there are voices like George Galloway, which are now totally peripheral. At one point, he was a very central voice 20 years ago in the British politics. The left on the British politics has collapsed over the past 10, 15 years. So whatever dissident voices are, they have totally disappeared. So there are no real voices that are questioning what United States is actually, and why United, they might actually re-emerge after a while. There's some very cautious voices. They do appear in Foreign Affairs or, which is perhaps the most in London Review books, that why ultimately we have reached that stage where we're fighting Russia in Ukraine.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank our viewers today, and inshallah we'll be back with another look at the Russia-Ukrainian crisis. It seems like it's an ongoing thing. Thank you so much.
And maybe on the Pakistani politics.
Pakistani politics. Yeah.
Thank you.